It begins as an attempt to placate a savage god, and culminates in the clarion call of the fascist fatherland, with its necrophiliac rites and ceremonies of self-oblation. J.M. Coetzee writes in Life and Times of Michael Kay of how someone may be simply another brick in the pyramid of sacrifice that someone would eventually climb and stand straddle-legged on top of, roaring and beating his chest and announcing himself emperor of all he surveyed. G.W.F. Hegel, a thinker sometimes mistakenly thought to take a sanguine view of the human condition, writes, "Even as we look at history as the slaughter bench on which the happiness of nations, the wisdom of states, and the virtue of individuals have been sacrificed, a question also necessarily arises in our thoughts. To what final end have these monstrous sacrifices been made? For conventional liberal wisdom, self-fulfillment and self-dispossession are essentially at odds. This is not the case for a more radical outlook. One must take a remarkably indulgent view of humankind, as many a liberal does, to assume that the self can come into its own without that fundamental breaking and refashioning of which sacrifice has been one traditional sign. It would be the equivalent of claiming that the forms of political life we see around us could evolve into a state of justice without any notable degree of turbulence. Those who oppose sacrifice to the mutuality of love forget that any durable version of the latter involves the self-giving typical of the former. There is indeed a species of sacrificial love that involves wreaking violence upon the self. The problem is to refuse this death-dealing ideology while recognizing with Hegel that in a more fruitful sense of the term, the inner structure of love is sacrificial in any case, though we are speaking once again of reciprocal self-giving, not of the abject capitulation of one partner to the dominion of the other. As one commentary puts it, sacrifice and self-denial are not a goal in themselves, but the substance of forgetting one's own self in loving the other. Forgetting is a questionable claim, given that love enhances the self in the very act of decentering it. Even so, it provides a useful corrective to the fashionable view that sacrifice is necessarily a form of self-mutilation. That orthodoxy has been well-nigh unanimous in repudiating the concept of sacrifice as barbarous and benighted. In the wake of Thomas Hobbes, for whom the highest moral duty is self-preservation, Ronald Dworkin claims that one's responsibility for others cannot extend to excessive self-sacrifice, given that one's primary obligation is to one's own life. It is a brand of ethics well suited to middle-class suburbia. There is indeed in Dworkin's view a moral duty to come to the aid of others, but only if the difficulties they face are severe, the cost of the assistance is tolerable, and those who require such help depend on you in particular to provide it. In similar spirit, John Rawls opposes the idea of sacrifice for the greater good, denying that a loss of freedom for the few can be justified by the welfare of the many. Jürgen Habermas claims that rational morality puts its seal on the abolition of sacrifice, no doubt with slain goats rather than the dead of the French resistance in mind. It is remarkable that when the term sacrifice enters the discussion, the modern liberal mind turns spontaneously to such issues as domestic servitude and death in the cause of military glory, rather than to the career of Constance Markievicz or the death of Malcolm X. The modern era's skepticism of sacrifice is nowhere more evident than in its uncertain grasp of the notion. By and large, it has come to mean the voluntary relinquishing of what one finds valuable. But renunciation is only one feature of sacrifice, and not always the most prominent. It is true that it can play a major role in the practice. In his classic study, Primitive Culture, the Victorian anthropologist Edward Burnett Tyler argues that the sacrificial gift is prized by the gods not for itself, but as a token of the worshipper's yielding up of something precious. The gift must be